Institute. We are based in Cape Town, but we work right across the Southern African region and also East Africa. And we are busy at this time getting ready for COP29, which is starting next week. And this session, the purpose of this session is for us to learn from each other, as well as have the frame set for us by Steve Nichols. As you can see on the screen, you can see our agenda for the afternoon. And we're really excited to have such a diverse audience today, and we're looking forward to hearing from you as well further on in the schedule. So it is after 2:05, and what I would like to do is just to pass over to Afikile, who's going to lead us in a short prayer before we get started as a faith-based organization. Afi, over to you.
Thank you, Francesca. Good afternoon, everyone. If you can all just bow our heads and close our eyes for a short prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we come before you with gratitude for this opportunity to gather virtually. We thank you for the technology that allows us to connect, learn, and show across distances. We ask for your blessings on this time together. Please bless all the presenters, the participants, and all the discussions that are going to unfold. May this session be fruitful, and may all those that are involved are strengthened and learn as much as they can. In Jesus' name I pray, amen.
Thank you, Afi. Thanks so much. And I see we've got a few more people, which is great. And so I'm just going to take this moment to talk a little bit more about SAFCEI and the work that we do. As I said, we're based in Cape Town. We're a Southern African Faith Communities Environment Institute. And our aim is really to work together as a collective of concerned people of all faiths and none who are looking at the issues of climate change, the climate crisis. And we do that with a couple of different lenses. We look at food and climate justice. We look at energy. And we also look at animal justice, which is around animal welfare and the protection of farmed animals. And all of these things are linked to each other. And the reason why we have the multi-faith approach that we take is because all of our faiths, all of the scriptures and religious texts speak about this common golden thread of doing unto the other as you would have done unto yourself. And so we see ourselves as part of a vibrant community of life, very much humans as a part of it rather than in domination over. And this collective approach and this collaborative approach means that we're very interested in the knowledge that's in the room. And so we structure our webinars to be more of an exchange of knowledge and a sharing. But that being said, we also acknowledge that maybe some people don't know that much about COP29 and would need to have a framework placed for the issue. And for that purpose, we are very pleased to welcome Steve Nichols from the South African Presidential Climate Commission. Steve is a policy, I want to call him expert. He might disagree with me, but he really does modeling and helps us to understand the decision-making points that we are in terms of the climate crisis and governance. And he can give us some insights into the main themes we're going to be looking at COP29 and the challenges that we're going to face as civil society going, looking at what government decisions are going to be looking like, and the key points around the coming climate change conference. So Steve, if you're happy, and you're ready to go. It's so wonderful to see so many familiar faces and also new faces here on the webinar. For some reason, my webinars are asking me whether I'm speaking Portuguese, so I'm just going to ignore that. I'm not sure what's going on there. Typical Zoom. So I'm going to now hand over to Steve. Steve, if you have slides, I hope you're able to present them yourself, or you're just going to be speaking today. Welcome, Steve, and over to you.
Yeah, hi everybody, and thanks for having me. Yeah, I'm just gonna talk today, if that's okay. It's slides I think might complicate things. So yeah, COPs are fascinating but complex beasts, and so I'll try to give you a little bit of history about where they come from and what's happened so far, and then talk a little bit about what will happen in Baku, or what might happen in Baku. But I must open with a huge caveat. The election of Donald Trump yesterday kind of changes a lot, potentially everything. So this happened actually just before Marrakesh, the COP in Marrakesh, when Donald Trump was first elected. And basically it happened while the US negotiators were on the plane. And so they arrived in Marrakesh with this huge amount of uncertainty as to what US negotiation positions would be and how they might deal with them. And effectively, they'll be in that same position again. And it's worth reflecting on what happened last time Donald Trump was president. He basically started the proceedings of withdrawing the United States from the Paris Agreement. He made getting the science approved within the COP process much more difficult and much more challenging. He started to gut the research institutions, at least in the US, that provided some of the core science into that scientific consensus process. And then finally, he threatened multilateralism itself, both by threatening to withdraw from the negotiations entirely, but also by withdrawing funding from the UN. And the United States is the biggest funder and host of the UN. And so multilateralism is really important for developing countries, because otherwise what happens is climate agreements and international agreements become bilateral agreements between the huge trading powers, Europe, US, India, China, and those of us with smaller economies basically get left out. And so multilateralism is where we have a voice, where we can have a collective voice. And so, hopefully it won't be as bad as it was the first time, but it'll probably be worse. We don't know. But that's kind of the situation that we're in going into COP, and kind of really critical global economic stability issues. A recent report basically suggested that a Trump presidency will add 4 billion tons of CO2 to our emissions between now and 2030, purely on the basis of the policies that he will either renege on or make. So the caveat is we don't know what will happen at COP with any kind of certainty now, predominantly because the US will be reticent about engaging on core issues. But in itself, that will be something interesting to watch, as long as you can kind of divorce yourself from the horror of it. So maybe just a bit of background history on the COPs themselves. So the COPs were really born out of the Rio Summit. So some of you will remember, I think it was 1992 was the Rio Summit, and world leaders gathered to discuss kind of environmental threats in general. And there were actually three processes that emerged from that Rio +20. One was on desertification, one was on biodiversity, and one was on climate change. And each of those have their own COPs. It stands for Conference of the Parties. So it's really all of the states of the world meeting to discuss these important issues. And they progress at different paces. So I think COP on biodiversity has just had COP19 or something like that. Whereas in the climate change space, we're going to COP29. And so that means we've been at this for 29 years. So that's kind of where these things came from. And really the history of COPs up until Paris were trying to get countries of the world to agree to top-down, legally binding constraints on emissions. And the Kyoto Protocol, which I think was COP3-ish, somewhere around there, is the primary example. And they spent the next kind of 15 years trying to get people to agree to these top-down binding constraints, and the world was split into Annexure A countries, so basically developed countries and developing countries that would have different legal obligations, but basically they could never agree to it. And partly it was because of the rise of some developed countries, like developing countries like China and India, suddenly were emitting more or pretty close to the developed world. And so this idea of splitting developed and developing countries was being contested, and a whole bunch of other things were going on. And so basically they failed to do that. And Copenhagen, which was the sort of one of the more famous COPs, is where that all broke down. And they were basically not able to reach an agreement, and basically had to scrap a whole bunch of things and start again. And so from Copenhagen to Paris, was this kind of rebuilding phase. And Durban was in that phase and was credited, in South Africa, they were credited with helping to get unity again, and partly because of this concept of hotlas, how we gather and how we meet and how we discuss, and those kinds of processes were introduced to the COP, that then became the Talanoa dialogues. And so this inclusiveness became a much bigger driver between Copenhagen and Paris. And the miracle of Paris, which I always put in inverted commas, was that we then agreed to this bottom-up voluntary process, which was much more inclusive. So all countries in the world basically agreed that they would set commitments that were the best that they could do based on the constraints that they have in their country. So those commitments were called nationally determined contributions. You will have heard of NDCs, and that they would test the veracity of those commitments. Veracity is not quite the right word, against what's called a global stocktake. So you would set emissions. A few years later, you would do a global stocktake, which would look at all of the available science and basically assess whether those commitments were sufficient for us to meet the global goal, climate change goal of well below 2 degrees, ideally pursuing efforts to stay below 1.5 degrees. So all countries submitted their NDCs, and then last year was the global stocktake, which basically concluded that we are not on track to meet our climate goals, that we are on track to be somewhere between 2.1 and 2.9 degrees, which, if you remember that the Southern Africa warms at twice the rate of the global average. So here in South Africa and our neighbors, we would be heading towards between 2 and 4 degrees of global warming, 3 and 4 degrees of global warming. So, not a good picture. And so the idea then is that you would accelerate your ambition in response to this global stocktake, and that would then be the NDCs that will be submitted next year. So not this COP, but the following COP, which will be in Brazil. So that's kind of the importance of the Paris Agreement and the sort of voluntary architecture. So it's really built on goodwill. It's built on those people making those commitments, actually delivering against those commitments. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. So then, just to give you a sense of the sort of mood of the COPs. So what ends up happening is you cycle between political COPs and administrative COPs. And the political COPs tend to coincide with some big agreement or some big part of the process. So, for example, Paris was important. Last year in UAE was important because of the consensus. This year is an administrative COP. It's not going to attract huge political attention. I don't think there'll be very many presidents in attendance. Whereas if you think about Paris, what basically how Paris was saved is many presidents from countries around the world basically flew into Paris for the last couple of days and hammered out agreement at a political level, and then passed that agreement on to the negotiators, who then had to kind of work out the details and what they often call the rules. And so this COP is a kind of rules COP. It's working out, what are we going to do? How are we going to structure things? There is some political interest, which I'll touch on just now. But generally, it's going to be an administrative COP. COPs, it'll be smaller, 20 to 30,000 people, I would imagine, as opposed to sort of 50 to 80,000 people, depending on the political nature of the COP. And can be more interesting because it gets into much more technical detail. But next year will be a political COP because everybody will be releasing their NDCs, and we will be testing whether people have appropriately updated their ambition. So that's kind of a little bit of background history. I hope that helps frame things a little bit. So the key issues for this COP, COP29 in Baku in Azerbaijan, is it's being billed as a finance COP. And that's kind of interesting because it ties in with the whole issue of justice and fairness and equity, which really is the overall theme that I want to touch on at the end. And effectively what has happened is in Copenhagen, developed countries in particular, made commitments to support developing countries in their transition. And they made a set of commitments, one of which was to supply $100 billion of climate finance per year between then and 2025, which they have not managed to do. And so that kind of taints the conversation. Well, one of the fundamental principles of the negotiations is this idea called common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. And basically countries agreeing that climate change is caused differentially by different countries based on their level of industrialization and development. And so an African country has not contributed much to carbon emissions and therefore bears a different level of individual responsibility, but shares in the collective responsibility of delivering a country, developing the world from climate change. And so the way that would play out as a simple example is everybody has to reduce their emissions, but developing countries can reduce their emissions at a slightly slower rate than developed countries. So the part of that common but differentiated responsibility is developed countries supporting developing countries in their transition, and we use this framing called means of implementation. And so developed countries are meant to support with climate finance, with trade, with capacity building, with skills development, with IP transfer, and that sort of package of support then would help developing countries transition whereas they may have lost out on historical opportunities. So the big focus of this COP is trying to resolve some of those common but differentiated responsibility in relation to climate finance, and in particular what we do about the pre-2020 commitments. And it's embedded in a broader international conversation about financial sector reform. And so if you look at interest rates for developed countries in relation to developing countries tend to pay 2 to 6% more on cost of capital per dollar, which makes it much harder to invest your way out of things. Everything's more expensive. Even clean technologies like renewable energy are more expensive. There are issues around debt, there are issues around economic power. And so there's a broader discussion, some of it led by President Ruto of Kenya, that are around broader financial sector reform. And all of this is framed in an acronym a phrase called New Collective Quantified Goal. So what is the new goal? So before it was 100 billion. Some estimate we need 5 times that for developing countries. And so what is this new collective quantified goal going to look like? And so you'll see this NCQG phrase everywhere, because that is going to be the core focus of this particular COP, which does give it a bit of sort of political interest, as well as on top of the sort of administrative things happening in other spaces. Other core things to watch is within the subject of climate finance, how we deal with carbon credits and carbon markets, which are taken care of in a thing called Article 6. So when you see people refer to Article 6, they're talking about carbon markets and carbon credits and how we administer those. Loss and damage, and again, closely linked to this idea of common but differentiated responsibility. Those countries that have caused climate change through their historical emissions should be responsible for the damages that it causes. Now, it's very interesting to follow the language in these conversations, because the Americans and the Europeans will set this conversation up as a kind of, we're providing support as opposed to a restitution fund. So there's no legal obligation on us, there's no liability on us, but we accept that this damage needs some kind of response, and we're better suited to respond. And so often in these negotiations, it's really about how you view justice and equity and responsibility over history, and how countries are trying to shirk it and how countries are trying to allocate it. And that's really the core of all of the conversation, is how do we allocate this responsibility. So loss and damage is this fund that was established, or there's a loss and damage fund which was established last year that now has to be capitalized, and the rules have to be set. And so questions like, will they allow private sector capital to contribute to this fund, or will it exclusively be public sector capital, will be at the core of the discussions for loss and damage. The Just Transition Work Program is something that South Africa worked very hard to get onto the agenda. It was sort of finally achieved at Egypt in COP29, and the ongoing dialogue about justice and what is justice and how does that translate into a set of activities and actions is a very interesting area to watch in COP this year. The NDCs, as I've mentioned, are obviously important. So countries will go to COP this year and signal or test the market. You know, we think of sitting in NDC like this, how do people react? Oh, we might not get away with that, or we might. So there's a lot of political interest in how countries think about and approach their nationally determined contributions. And then the last area that's really worth watching is adaptation. And so there's this refrain that you will know that we want to have equal balance between adaptation and mitigation, and this is a big South African negotiation point, and so that all of this finance that we talk about in the new goal must be distributed between adaptation and mitigation, and that, you know, and then the second part of adaptation is, how will we deal with the idea that we've probably breached 1.5 degrees? How will that change the way we frame targets? And I think it's important to note that every 0.1 of a degree is important. So even if we miss 1.5 degrees, that doesn't shift the target to 2 degrees. That shifts the target to 1.6 and then 1.7 and then 1.8. Every 10th of a degree really matters. So that's kind of the framing of the core issues. It's interesting watching the politics. So the countries kind of represent themselves, but they also belong to negotiation blocs or groups. And so South Africa, for example, negotiates on its own behalf, but it also belongs to the Africa group. It belongs to the group called G77 plus China. So it's 77 developing economies plus China. And it belongs to a group that is BASIC, which is basically BRICS without Russia. So Brazil, South Africa, India, and China. And so South Africa has to manage its political interests in the process with the competing or complementary political interests from these three blocks. And so it can get quite technical. And I guess the only way to make the actual negotiations interesting is to be aware of what people are doing. So if you sit in the negotiations themselves for the first time, it's dreadfully boring. You've got these big blocks of text that have alternatives in brackets, in sort of square brackets. The Americans would like it phrased like this, the Indians would like it phrased like this, the South Africans would like it phrased, and the negotiation as well. Whose phrasing wins out in the end? And unless you know the politics, you really are just, well, who cares if they use which or would or shall or should? But in the context of that global negotiations and politics, it becomes very interesting. But you have to know the detail. So watching this politics is very interesting. South Africa's priorities going into the COP are really the global goal on adaptation, Article 6, this NCQG I mentioned, the Just Transition Work Program, the Mitigation Work Program, loss and damage, and a thing called the Warsaw Mechanism, and then transparency in general. But I think the key thing, particularly I think of relevance and interest to the faith community, is the idea that all of these negotiations and the tension that exists in the negotiations, and this is now my personal opinion, is subject to how you think about the concept of justice. And so it's absolute worst case, developed countries and developed companies think about justice as a public relations or employee relations issue. As long as I've told you what's happening and it's basically a plan and you're going to get a settlement or some skills retraining out of it, then that process is just. And at the other end of the spectrum, you have perspectives held by South Africa, India, and others that are basically arguing, no, there is a built-in injustice to the global economic architecture that needs to be corrected. And that plays out in all sorts of ways. It plays out in economic power, it plays out in trade power, it plays out in who has access to capital, who controls particular resources. And so you'll see, when people are arguing about particular things, like I mentioned in the loss and damage space, at its very core, it's a debate about, well, who's responsible and how do we resolve this in the most equitable way, with very differing views on what is just and what is not. And to return back to Donald Trump, this really kind of messes with the system, because you move to someone who has a very insular view of what justice is and who should benefit. So it's America first ahead of all other nations, whereas this really is about global justice. It's about accounting for historical emissions, to which US are one of the biggest contributors. So the subtext of responsibility is also fascinating to watch. So just to wrap up, and then happy to take some questions from people, but what actually physically happens at the COP, it's kind of interesting. So it's hosted by a particular country, and then there are zones. So there's a blue zone, a green zone, and then of course the rest of the city. And there's lots of activity. So even if you don't have accreditation, which you need to get into one of the blue or the green zone, there's still lots to do in Baku. There'll be events hosted by third parties, people like C40 and Bloomberg and CDP and big sort of environmental movements in hotels around the city. And you can fill up a substantial chunk of your time just attending conferences and workshops hosted by these organizations. It is better, though, if you have accreditation to get into the various precincts. And so the green zone is typically inhabited by civil society, so WWF and faith movements and others will host pavilions in the green zone, and there they'll host side events. And then the real prize is to have accreditation to get into the blue zone. And you get two sort of areas of activity in the blue zone. The one is the negotiations themselves. So you can go and sit in and watch countries debate and negotiate particular topics. As I say, dreadfully boring unless you have a real insight into the debate around the language. But the really interesting stuff happens in the side event space. So all countries then will have a pavilion, and they will host events also by a whole range of international institutions. So at any given point at COP, you're spoiled for choice. You could have 3 to 5 events competing. So I recall on one occasion I was hosting an event that I thought I'd designed really beautifully, and nobody came, and I couldn't understand what happened. And then I found out that one of the other organizations was hosting an event where the speakers were Prime Minister Modi from India, Arnold Schwarzenegger, and the American sort of Secretary of State. And so I was like, okay, can't compete with that. But that's the kind of space that you're in. Everybody's kind of competing for attention, trying to get their views across. It's a really excellent way to catch up with both the sort of latest state of the politics, but also the science. So a lot of key reports are launched in the next two weeks. For example, the one that I'm looking forward to is the Carbon Gap Report, which sort of looks at what budget is left to us for our emissions to stay below 1.5, 1.6, 1.7, 1.8 degrees, and therefore what are the likelihood of us being able to do that. South Africa hosts a joint pavilion with the PCC, with the NBI. The PCC is a co-sponsor, but the core hosts are the NBI, National Business Initiative, and government, DFFE. And that's where a lot of South African action happens. So if you're interested in South Africa and you are traveling to COP, that's a great place to kind of check in, meet other South Africans. They do have a big launch party normally on the first Monday, which is also a good way to meet people. So I'll stop there, Francesca, and see if hopefully that was helpful. But if there are any questions, happy to be guided by people on things they'd like more detail on.
Thanks so much, Steve. That was a wonderful whistle stop through COP. And yeah, we have been there. We know that feeling when you've done all this work for your side event and then someone else comes with a much better offer and then no one comes. In the olden days at COPs, if you organized food, which was difficult and expensive, everyone would come. But I've seen lately they don't do that. So yeah, it's quite a roller coaster ride. I'm going to pass over to my colleague Mishka, who's going to lead on a discussion with people online. So I'm going to just hand over to Mishka. And I may be one of the people asking a question a little bit. Thanks, Steve.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Steve, for those insights and breaking it down for us because it can be quite overwhelming. So thank you for that. So I'm just going to open the floor now for questions. This is a great time to clarify any points from Steve's presentation. If there's something you're curious about, whether it's COP itself or some of the key expectations for this year, and then feel free to raise your hand or type it in the chat box, or you can just unmute yourself and ask directly.
I'm going to go first, and then others can also join in. Steve, I mean, you gave us a really interesting and thorough overview of the COP, and also some of the priority areas for South Africa, and interesting in the difference between the different COPs and this being a finance COP. I wanted to know, for yourself, will you be attending the COP in person, or are you going to, I know there's virtual badges and in-person badges, and they've been distributed a little bit differently this time. And if you aren't going to be there in person, how do you suggest for people who aren't going to be attending, what is the best way to keep up with the COP developments?
So I won't be attending this year. I've attended 10, so I'm taking a short break. But the Presidential Climate Commission will be there, and we have, I think, 6 commissioners attending, as well as our Executive Director, Dr. Crispin Olver. But yeah, I'm used to following them being there. I guess the best way to follow them from home is to pay attention to the media. They do have these groups within that are sort of non-state actor groups within the negotiations that have different acronyms, like there's an NGO group and there's a business NGO group and so on. And they tend to post daily reports. I've just forgotten the name of the civil society one. It's called Eco Watch or something like that, but it's basically a daily update of what's happening at COP, and they do kind of fun things. So the NGO group in particular has an award that they give every day called the Dinosaur of the Day, and it's for someone who makes some ridiculous statement about fossil fuels, and then they dress up as a dinosaur and wander around with a picture of that person. So there's a little bit of silliness that goes on as well. But no, the best way from a distance is to do that. A couple of the events are broadcast online, and the UN normally has on their website a sort of record of side events and which are accessible online and which are not. But again, I'm not sure how organized Baku had been this year. I haven't actually started to look yet. But there will be side events that have online access. So for example, I'm speaking at an event at COP this year without being there, and I'll be dialing in from here. So, if you monitor that, you can dial into some pretty good events. And as I say, monitoring some of the key organizations, WWF, UN, they all normally, WRI, CDP, they all normally launch big reports around this time.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. Are there any other comments?
Am I still with you? Have I been dropped?
We can hear you, Steve. I think it's
Okay.
just the connectivity is a bit off and on.
Apologies.
If there are no more, can everybody hear? If there aren't any more questions or comments, then I think I'll hand over to Francisca for the next session, which will speak a little bit about the role of faith leaders and faith institutions and SAFCEI as companies. So, Francisca, over to you.
Thanks, Mishka. And everyone, if you do have questions, please do write them in the chat if you're not sure. Steve, I think you opened with the most interesting and important issue that we face, which is the fact that Donald Trump, as the president of the USA, will have a massive impact on global climate negotiations and ambition and ability for us to really meet the emission goals that we have. And I know in the States, because of how the government system works with the federal government and this, I know that the state actors have a lot of independence, and there's a lot of really good developments happening at state level. And I just wonder, now that it's the second time round, maybe we don't know yet. You were saying that there could be a massive increase in emissions, but I'm also wondering if the U.S. government has got smarter with the issue, and if you have a sense of globally how other actors could respond to the U.S. I think it's an interesting space, the COP, because it is about a negotiated consensus building approach. And we've seen, however, a lot in the last year how UN systems are being subverted and not effective. And I wonder if you have any comments, Steve, on sort of this issue of how we do UN systems, UN negotiations, when there's actors who are acting far outside agreed bounds, just more widely. And also if there's going to be any impact on South Africa's ambition for the just energy transition and its funding, the climate finance to South Africa with the Trump presidency. So that's a sort of a 3-bar question for you, Steve. I hope you don't mind. But that would be great if you would just weigh in again and give us a little bit more of your analysis. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't mind, as long as you don't mind that it's purely in the realm of conjecture at this point. Look, the challenge, there are multiple challenges with the Trump administration in the US. The first being that the US ambition will decrease, which feeds the discussion about global justice. So it's very hard to convince a developing country to then take stronger action when the primary proponent of historical emissions is not taking sufficient action. So why, the kind of narrative we hear is, well, why should I do that when the US is retreating or going back to coal? The challenge with that is a lot of the economic data shows that we would be better off pursuing a green transition either way. But of course, it's not purely a data-driven conversation, so to speak. So how we deal with the issues of perceived inequity and perceived injustice and how that impacts ambition around the world is hard to say. But we would anticipate that it would lead to a lowering of ambition globally, which is problematic for the poor, because the people that are most impacted by climate change and extreme events and drought and food insecurity are not the wealthy, but the poor. And so this from an equity point of view, this is a big blow. And so I think to the second part of your question is how do we collectively respond, is I think we need to double down on this idea of justice and equity that has both a domestic component and an international component. So domestically, we could argue that South Africa could go to a net zero competitive economy, but maintain the existing class and capital structures, which is not what we want. We need to fundamentally change that domestically. So how we think about distributive policy within the context of South Africa is important, and there are many historical injustices to be addressed in that process. But of course, you could take that exact logic globally, and that the America and Europe's actions on the world have had similar kinds of impacts to, say, a past colonial or apartheid government. But of course, this is not an easy debate for people. It's connected to the whole idea of accepting privilege and understanding that white men are not the only people on the planet. And so this is the big challenge. And so it'll set that back as well, but potentially could galvanize other countries to unite on some of these key justice issues. We don't know. That's what we can kind of hope for, and that you'll start to get alliances outside the US. But if I look at the WhatsApps from various global leaders in the past couple of days congratulating Trump, I'm not super optimistic about that, I have to say. I can't remember what the third component of your question was.
I wanted to understand better. Sorry, there's a bit of an echo. We're having some sound issues. I wanted to understand better, Steve, if you can hear me, that with a Trump administration, which is so anti-climate justice and anti-climate finance and anti-climate action, I mean, they're just anti the whole negotiation process. So Nima, in answer to your question, Trump is the opposite of helpful in these issues, unfortunately. What implications does that have for South Africa's financing of its just energy transition? So I know that there are global trends geopolitically. We've seen it in Europe, the sort of tightening of borders and tightening of monies for the global South. But I'm also wondering if there's going to be some direct impacts for us from what you can see from US funding for just energy transitions in South Africa, and maybe more widely in our region.
Yeah, so I guess there are a couple of ways to think about that. The one is the direct provision of finance. So our Just Energy Transition Investment Plan, about 1/8 of that money is provided by the US. I'm not sure if that's at risk or not. I mean, I think it's a done deal. I think that would continue. But of course, future funding cycles are unlikely to include the United States, so there'll be less capital available. The other way to think about it is foreign trade policy. So the United States could potentially cut us out of AGOA. They could also impose bigger trade tariffs on the products that we do export to the United States. In some ways, we're a little bit protected from that in the sense that the US is a major export partner, but not close to the biggest. I can't remember the exact numbers at the moment. So it would potentially threaten parts of the economy, but and then there are also issues around what the US does domestically and how that impacts the availability of different kinds of technologies. So they may close the market on particular commodities, or they may not produce things that we want and then overproduce things that we don't want. So one of the things that could happen is that America ups its output of fossil fuels, which drives the price of global fossil fuels down, which means that it's much harder for a developing country to justify moving away from, relatively cheaper fossil fuels to other cleaner forms of energy, particularly when you get into the space of electric vehicles and liquid fuels. I think coal would probably still continue to decline, but we might see an increase in production of liquid natural gas and other forms of fossil fuels. So those are kind of the major impacts, but the most direct threats, I think, are related to the adoption of the science and the basis of the science within the negotiations. So it'll be much harder to agree ambitious ways forward if you're always fighting about whether the science is real or not. And then, of course, the idea of multilateral protection. If we don't have as strong a voice as a result of the weakening of multilateral institutions, then the kinds of bilateral actions that the US and others could take against us become riskier for us.
Yeah. So it's a complex scenario, and it means that we don't know exactly how it's going to play out. But there's a lot of potential different outcomes and different ways that we could be very negatively impacted. Before I move on to the hand that's up, I want to ask you if there's any way that you think it could be a positive impact. Can we think of anything that could, I mean, it's a kind of a curious way to look at it, because we so often just see Trump as a very negative force in this arena. But is there any way that this could potentially, it could actually, accelerate action on climate change?
Not really. I mean, the one area that is a potential positive is this Inflation Reduction Act, which in the United States is a big incentive scheme provided to the manufacturing of renewable energy as well as the construction use of renewable energy, that has predominantly benefited red states. So states like Texas have been the majority adopter of those incentives. And so there should hopefully be some resistance from Republican states to the president trying to withdraw those laws and those incentives, because it's the Republicans that have benefited the most. And then there are some very theoretical ideas that you'll see in the popular media about having a strong man in the United States might lead to some global stability. I personally think that's unlikely, but that's what some are saying. So you might see peace in the Middle East and peace in the Ukraine as a result of Trump just saying, stop it, or I'm going to do something crazy like bomb you with a nuclear bomb. But, that's very speculative and conspiracy theorist. So I think the only real tangible area we have is this idea that the Inflation Reduction Act triggered quite vigorous transition within the United States that will hopefully continue and get some support from Republican institutions in general.
When they start seeing the cash benefit, when they start seeing, and hopefully it has enough momentum that he can't squash it. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see. Steve, while we still got you, you've been so helpful. I don't know if you are okay to stay on for a little bit longer, but I do see some questions, and I think it'd be interesting to bounce them off you. Before we go to the hand that's up, I'm just going to read a couple of the comments. First, we've got Frederick, who says, you have said one thing to be talked about is finance. Do you think that most developing countries are not using the funds to really mitigate climate change? We have about 41 billion that's said to be untraceable. I don't know where that stat comes from, but have you heard something like that? Oh, sorry, Steve, we can't hear you. You're muted.
Thank you. Amateur era after all this time on Zoom and Teams. No, I'm not familiar with the 41 billion stats, but I think there is a general challenge around debt, and this is part of the financial sector reform conversations underway, that developing countries are often saddled with high levels of debt relative to their GDP, and therefore and the cost of that debt is very high. For reasons that are sometimes spurious. Capital is weighted by risk, and there's a certain bias in how people understand risk. And so if you have a Western institution run by white men, they would perceive an African country as high risk just because of, inherent bias. And so understanding how much of that risk-adjusted interest rate is actually related to risk is important. So, for example, there are some USAID-funded energy programs in Africa whose default rates are like ridiculously low, less than 10%. And so why would you put a higher cost of capital on those projects? You know, you would need some proper justification for that. So there are those kinds of complexities. And then, of course, the quality of spend is very important. So it is possible that developing countries take this international support, which is often in the form of concessional debt, so debt priced lower than what you would get on the market. And then you spend it on something bad that doesn't generate revenues and it burdens the country further with debt. So the bigger challenge for us as developing countries is to make sure that we use the money that we do borrow, even if it is concessional, to do things that are very positive for the development of the country. And that's not easy to do. You know, there's lots of competing interests around social needs and so on. And so that's a hot debate.
Yeah, this thing about separate and additional funding for climate versus development, and then we don't want to necessarily separate them because development can mean climate resilience. It's all very, very complicated. But the idea, of course, that there's a lot of corruption in Africa and money that's given then doesn't go to the people in need, it somehow gets trapped in the echelons of government, is an issue not just in Africa, but around the world that we're seeing also with finance. So it's not a straightforward story as you've been telling us, Steve. Also, there's another question here or comment. Rich nations trying to shrink their climate finance responsibilities because they have for so long refused to deliver on their previous promises or even make serious discussions on funding. And what does the COP election mean for the US election mean for COP29? It's a moment of profound apprehension in global climate diplomacy. Yeah, I would say that is absolutely true, Yolanda. I know you've come a little late and maybe you didn't hear when Steve first started and how he started talking about the Trump administration and that's how he started talking about COP29 was with the Trump administration because of its huge impact. And Steve, I don't know if you want to add to what you said earlier, but you may want to at this point. Oh, Steve, you're muted.
I think it's automatically muting me. I think that it is a valid point. You know, I would agree. It's very uncertain as to how it will turn out. You know, there's a small part of me that hopes it will, you know, continue as usual, but I think it's likely to have a very negative impact. Yeah,
absolutely. Absolutely. And then Steve, Lancia says, I've never attended any COP and I have no idea how it's organized. And I'm wondering if it's possible to do some deliberate mapping of possible funders by region of the world. This could give us an indication of how resources are possibly distributed. I mean, it's a great question. A lot of people have looked at it. I think part of the problem is that not all governments are transparent. But Steve, would you like to comment on that? Is there any resource you could recommend? I know some people are kind of trying to track it, but it does get very complicated from what I can see.
Yeah, it gets very complicated. And as you say, there's double counting across the system. Do you count it as development funding or climate funding? And there is an effort that's made by the Climate Policy Initiative, CPI, and they do an annual report or a biannual report possibly of tracking climate finance and its flows. And we, the Presidential Climate Commission, do one for South Africa, so you can see where climate finance is coming from. I mean, just say if you do go to COP, there's a lot of activity around these kinds of topics. And so there'll no doubt be more than one event on that particular topic. But yeah, very complicated to track. They're as reliable as we have. They're not incredibly reliable.
Yeah, so taken with a caveat that it's not everything. Now, we had a hand up, but I cannot see. Mulana, are you still in the room? I can't see you, but if you'd like to unmute. Ah, hi.
Yeah, it was, hello. It was me. I also wanted to know how to follow the COPs. And I like what Steve said, that things are agreed upon and other people just work outside of the margins of what is agreed upon. Yes, we will attend the COPs and listen and interact, but there's no hope because it goes back to what Kissinger said in 1973, that who controls the food controls the people, who controls the energy controls the continents, who controls the money controls the world. The US, it looks like no one at all can control them. Up until humanity as a whole, I'm talking now from a faith perspective, humanity as a whole reverses this by coming together to stop the situation that is going on where inequality is causing degradation of dignity of a lot of people who are called poor. But the quality of their lives is reduced by the systems themselves. And the environment and all creation also is degraded by the same situation of global domination. So we need, as humanity, to start talking about coming together to talk about the world that we live in, which I believe its economy is rigged and its humanity is shone. No one is brave enough to come forward and say no, or come together and say no. Certain people want to curry favor with the very system that they see is destructive. We need to do something. Thanks, Steve. We need to do something, but I don't know where we would start because I don't see us covering the whole world and telling everybody to sit down and talk. The victim and the beneficiary of what is happening now, this situation now, needs to sit down together and correct it. Beginning with climate and everything else, food, everything, education, everything is just, I would say, in shambles for those who are not in the inner circle of the global ruling elite. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mo Alima. That's a really strong and powerful intervention. I think as we get overwhelmed by the complexity of the issue, the fact that climate science cannot even tell us when we're at the tipping point, have we passed it already? What's going to happen? A lot of this is a big, slow-moving train crash sometimes. It feels that way, and it can be very, very overwhelming. And I want to encourage us, though, to remain grounded in our experience of climate change, the climate crisis, both as a witness to its impacts and where you can see possible ways through the crisis. And I want to say this because you could spend your whole life trying to understand the COPs and to keep up. It could be a full-time job for, several large institutions, and you still wouldn't be able to cover everything. So I think it's very important that we find out as much as we feel compelled to find out. Yes, keep educating ourselves. Yes, get familiar with the latest terms and the emerging issues. But also remember that the strength lies in our lived experience and our ability to advocate for the fact that the climate crisis is happening to most vulnerable communities now, and we can see its impacts. And therefore, the path to justice is very clear. So the fact that it's a northern historical debt through industrialization to the south it's not debated anymore. The fact that it is a debt that needs to be repaid is not something, so we can get into the complexities of how much finance, et cetera, but I want to guard us against that. I went to the last big finance COP was COP 15 at Copenhagen, and all the NGOs, literally all of them, spent days and nights and the whole year calculating how much climate change is going to cost us, because they felt if we get the numbers right, then we'll have the breakthrough. Just like previous COPs, people were saying, if we get the science right and we have enough compelling evidence, politicians will stop debating it. But the reality is politicians are political animals, and their motivations are not whether we're coming from a fact-based place or whether we know all the finance or whether we have all the information to hand. We can also influence them through hearts and minds. And I think in particular, and why I want to emphasize this, the role of faith communities, and it was actually the next section of our webinar, is what is the role of faith communities at a COP29 or even in the COP negotiations? So I want to get into that, but before I segue into that, I want to give Steve the chance to respond as well. And also, if anyone else has any other questions, and then we're going to move on to the next bit, which is going to be looking at the role of faith actors at COP. Thanks,
Thank
Steve.
you. I'm afraid I have to drop off, but I'm very grateful to have had the time with you. And I agree with everything the previous speaker said. I would just say that we mustn't fall into the trap of interpreting hope as binary. So what we are fighting here for is progressive levels of justice. And while we may have lost the battle for 1.5 degrees, keeping the battle alive for 1.6, 1.7, and the social impacts that will have is really important. But, you know, I joke, I think I told this to you, Francesca, I read a tweet a couple of years ago that kind of describes my life very well. It's how did my 20-year-old self choose a career filled with such existential dread? So, you know, I sympathize with feelings of hopelessness, but the hope is in the sort of daily victories. So thank you, everybody. It was lovely to speak to you all, and good luck with the rest of the session.
Thanks so much, Steve. You have been just so clear and helpful and informative, and we really appreciate you taking the time out of your schedule. I'm sure you're all extremely busy preparing for COP, even though you won't be there physically. I'm sure there's lots happening there at the Presidential Climate Commission. So we just want to say thanks again. Great to see you, and we look forward to engaging with you soon. Just so everyone knows, next Tuesday, the Presidential Climate Commission is doing a capacity building session on the NDCs. It's Tuesday, it's online. If you're in the Joburg area and you can travel and Muliama, you may want to go physically. They can help with some of your travel costs if you're in Joburg. If you're in the rest of the country, like the rest of us, you're going to have to join online. But we will put the links in the chat in a little while, just so you can all sign up for that meeting. It's going to be very interesting. And we may be lucky enough to see Steve again present on Tuesday. So thanks so much, Steve.
Thank you, Van. We'd really appreciate physical attendance. Yeah, thank you. Yeah,
bye-bye. You enlightened us greatly. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Thank you. See you soon. So yeah, that's why we like to get the expert in the room, because they make what's enormously complicated sound accessible and easy to understand. So yeah, we really appreciate Steve's presence today. And as I just said, Steve will be with us on Tuesday, the online meeting for going through the capacity building for what are these NDCs, the nationally determined contributions for South Africa. How is that going to help us achieve our climate goals? And what does it mean in terms of South Africa's climate preparedness? I really want to encourage you all to attend. I'm going to ask Mishka if she can please put that in the chat. For us, you can sign up, and anyone Joburg-based, there may be a few of you here on this call, can go in person. They will help you with your ground travel. So I really want to encourage you, please, to attend if you can. They would love to have you there too. And I think one of the things that I really want to commend the Presidential Climate Commission for, or the PCC, is that they're genuinely interested in engaging with the faith sector and spending time with us, helping us understand and engaging us in the consultative process for the just energy transition. So you can see all of that information is there in the chat now. Please make sure that you click on it and share it. Very important, share it with others. This is for South Africans, but look, if you're interested in South African nationally determined contributions and what those are, you can also join online. And those of you in person, please do go in your physical selves. So yeah, I now wanted to segue to the role of faith leadership, faith communities at the COP29. And I wanted to ask, before I start that part of our webinar, to ask how many of you in this room here have attended COP. And what I'd like you to do, please, is to, if you've attended COP, please raise your hand like this. So if you've attended COP, can you please use your raising of your hand under reactions? It's the heart on your Zoom, and raise your hand to show that you have attended a COP in the past or recently. So far, there's 2 of us. I'm sure there's more in the room who've attended COP. Let's see who else is here who has also attended COP. Just having a look to see if I can see anyone else. I know some of you might find it difficult to raise your hands, but actually it's a smaller number than I expected. And so we really appreciate that people who haven't had a chance to learn about this highly technical United Nations global country process, that you're interested enough to come to this webinar. I see that Mohammed Galant is also one of the COP attendees. So wonderful to have you with us. And so glad that you and Yolanda also have both attended COP. That's really wonderful to see. And I'm going to ask you whether, Yolanda, would you like to share why you think, as a person of faith, COP is important? Would you like to share your views on that? We do want to make these sessions more participatory. So I prefer it if it's not just me talking. So Yolanda, if you would be happy, or Mohammed Galant, if you would, I think that's Ridwan, if you would be willing to share why you, as a person of faith, feel that it's important to attend COP or to understand COP, or why you think faith leaders are important for the COP process. I would really appreciate to hear your thoughts on that.
Good afternoon.
Afternoon.
Everyone. Yes. I think I attended a COP in 2011 in Durban. It was a COP when it was hosted by South Africa. And I attended not as a look, I'm from the Muslim faith, but as a SAFCEI member, I attended COP that time, and also from the Muslim faith. I think that disappointingly that what happened was there was a lot of resolutions at that time made, but nothing was really practiced. Nothing was came into reality. And every year we have a COP, and then certain resolutions are made, but nothing comes to reality. So I think it is, I don't know what we can do about it, because the people who are causing climate change, they seem to be at COP and admit they are wrong, but they still go on with their wrongs. Basically, it goes like that. And that is disappointing. Disappointing with everything. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for those reflections on the lack of progress that we're seeing by those who are responsible at COP. Yolanda, would you like to share also your views on this?
Oh, yeah, thank you, Francesca, and good afternoon, everyone. My first COP was in Durban in 2007, no, 2011. It was a COP17. So since COP17 until today, I lost 60 COP that I did not attend it. So the question is why we believe, or that is important to include faith religion. When I'm back where I start to attend the COP and analyze the process, the evaluation of the COPs until today, maybe we can trust in our faith leaders, because it means that they have a words for hope. They have they can I'm not sure if they have opportunities to participate in the negotiation deeply. I'm not sure, but it's important we advocate that faith leaders must be part of the decision maker under the climate negotiation. On this space, they can influence the leaders, the parties, to change their minds. I think, yeah, the parties must change their minds, because all parties now, you remember COP28 last year in Dubai. For me, it was a COP for business. And I'm sure that even this COP, it will be other COP for business. So we don't want only COP for business. We need COP for hope. COP that will bring a new world for new generation. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Yolanda. Yeah, I really do agree with you. I think that absence of hope is yeah, a very important function of COP. And I think that one of the things that I wanted to highlight in this section now is that, as Steve was saying earlier, you get the more political COPs where a big political decision is going to be made, and you get the more administrative COPs where they're trying to iron out more technical details. And so the function of the COP, the way that it works is that there are negotiators and people who have a lot of technical skill and knowledge who try and set the text, and they work on it throughout the year on the different streams or areas of work, which are often coming from the past. So you'll hear something like the Kyoto Protocol, which we no longer use, but that came from the COP that was held in Kyoto. You'll hear the Marrakesh Agreement. That came from the COP that was held in Morocco. And COPs are always held in a different country every year, as part of this thing of it being a conference of the parties. And the conference is all of the countries coming together, and the parties are the countries who signed up to the treaty, signed up to the agreement. And so it's a conference of the parties, and it's all the governments around the world, and including some non-state actors, as well as observers, which are NGOs and faith institutions. And when you look at the COP process, the papers and the progress that's made in the first week of COP, then the second week, when people are physically meeting, that is presented and worked on further. And as we heard from Steve, you get a lot more scientific and other information available at the COP. And then in the second week, it's the more political end of the COP, where the ministers and some heads of states, sometimes many heads of states, gather and ratify agreements and progress. And as we know what happened, and Ridwan and Yolanda were talking about the COP in Durban, which was the last time we had a COP in Southern Africa. We have had one in Egypt since then. But that COP, there wasn't much progress made. And we were continuing to see the stalling that started at COP15 in Copenhagen that I mentioned, where climate finance wasn't enough to push the politicians over the the wall into making concrete, legally binding commitments to address their climate emissions. And so then we move forward with some progress being made in different places. I can say that the progress at COPs is incredibly slow. And sometimes you feel like you've moved entirely backwards. But usually there's some big push by the host country to get a new initiative in place that will address some aspect of climate change that is emerging. So what we saw was that, not a lot of big political agreement or movement. We just stalled really on the Kyoto Protocol. And it was only at COP29 in Paris. You hear of the Paris Agreement. That's the agreement that came out of Paris. It's a voluntary agreement. It's the one that says we all need to commit to reducing our fossil fuels. But it's also the one that it's not legally binding. So it's, it means that most people are coming along with it. But, they don't actually have to comply. And that's why next year's COP at Brazil is so important, because then we're going to see the results. We're going to see the nationally determined contributions, which is the country level commitments to being addressing emissions. And it will be another big political push for us to see greater ambition and greater investment and movement to address climate change. So that's just a little whistle-stop tour of the climate change process. But so I want to return to my original point, which was, why is it so important that faith leaders play a role in climate change? And I kind of started answering it earlier on, but I want to go more into it now. So as we've seen, there is a lot of technical scientific data that is worked on at a climate change conference. And there's a lot of finance data that is worked on and presented at a conference. And then, of course, there's individual countries' political aims and objectives. You will see that certain countries have very strong opinions on things like, how do we count? What's the correct way to count for a global stock take? How do we ensure that we are doing proper adaptation? And Africa tends to negotiate in a block. And it can be really exhausting and overwhelming for the negotiators who are working day and night and coming up against the political will of other countries that can really block progress. And so we can see there's the intellectual, academic, scientific aspects of COP, as well as the very draining interpersonal. And what is missing, and we've seen this time and time again in any big social movement, is for people to engage beyond their intellectual reasoning, the justifications, and really engage with their hearts and their guts and bring in other forms of knowing. And some of those other forms of knowing we know are our faith scriptures. And we know that in a time of crisis, how important the role of a faith leader is, both to hold their leadership to account, as well as to provide solace and to be a guide through the very dark time that we face. So faith leaders are a moral compass for society. And when faith leaders attend COPs, they are witnessing sometimes the progress that governments are making, but oftentimes the inadequacy of their decision-making and their inadequacy of their commitment and their inadequacy of their political will. And that's one thing that I can say for most heads of states, almost all of them have a faith that they, and a God that they consider themselves accountable to. So always remember the strength of you as a person of faith, what you can bring to a leader who perhaps needs you to encourage them further, who perhaps needs you to say, this is not enough, who perhaps needs you to say, let us pray and find some solace and strength from our faith at this difficult time. So these are all important aspects that faith can play, that one can be present and witness, one can bring the weight of one's faith leadership and the role that you play in all politicians' lives, in all of our lives. How is it that a faith leader can stand up and say, this is not enough? This needs to be addressed with more seriousness. And that can cut through the endless debates about finance, the arguments over how we put words into the text. That can take us up a level so that we start looking at the dignity of humanity, at the dignity of the community of nature that we live with. And it helps us to look at the big picture rather than getting broken down into all these very small pieces, which really at a COP can be consuming. I remember one of the COPs, I think it was at Bonn, there was a huge debate about whether we can have an S at the end of indigenous people or not. Are they indigenous peoples or are they indigenous people? Now, you know what that S signified? The sovereignty of the indigenous peoples, their sovereignty. And the state actors did not want to give the indigenous people that freedom. Now, this is where the voice of faith leaders is powerful. To speak truth to power, that's what I'm talking about. Speaking truth to power. And you can do it in so many different ways. In your prayer, in your sermons, in your witnessing, in your physical presence. There are many different ways that faith can support and guide this process. So I don't want us to underestimate the role. And you don't have to be a formal faith leader either. I want us to really think about how can I take action coming from the well and strength of faith within me that allows me to really persist and not get discouraged. I saw that Kamala Harris, when she made her concessionary speech to Trump, she said, in the night, in the dark, that's when stars are brightest. That's when we see the stars. So let's just remember that each of us are a star and a point of light, even when it's dark. And we know that stars allow us to navigate the world. That, that's how people got around all the oceans of the world, using stars. It's a way of navigation. So let's not underestimate the power and role of faith communities at times of darkness. We should not underestimate that, and we should not forget, because otherwise we're going to also find ourselves falling into despair and feeling this system doesn't work. Yes, we know that. It doesn't work. It really doesn't work. And let's not forget that. But yet, in that, we also, doesn't mean that we absolve ourselves of responsibility and of a role to play. Bearing witness, even to things that are not working at all, is incredibly powerful and important. So that's my contribution. And I can see some more thoughts in the comments, and I want to share that with you. So Martin, who's in Malawi, says he agrees with the point to encourage and influence through religious ways. And, that also gives you back the power, doesn't it? Because you know your faith, and you know how you can influence and what you can do. And then Yolanda also made a contribution. Faith leaders can raise awareness about climate change and its impact in local communities. So you don't have to be at COP, by the way. Attending this meeting this afternoon hopefully will give you some insights. We shared some material online. We also have a presentation that Steve did a couple of weeks ago at another workshop that we held, and we can share that as well. So we're very happy to share as much information as you will find useful that you can take back to your communities. Yolanda's also saying the impact of climate change on local communities and the inequalities that climate change creates for vulnerable communities. Just for us to even think about recognizing the inequality, that's very powerful. You know, sometimes we don't recognize this is inequality. And what happens? People sit in poverty and they become incredibly depressed and overwhelmed and feel that there's no hope. Because I think poverty is one of those things that takes away your hope and your sense of self-confidence and your sense that you can do something. So I think we should really think, even when we feel we have absolutely nothing, what we have is each other, and we are in this community together. And that makes us very, very powerful. So we must think about that, and then also think about local preparedness to climate change, as Yolanda is saying. So what is an appropriate thing for me to do where I live? It depends on the resources that I have or don't have, but there's always something that I can do. There's always something that I can do, even if it's going to say to my neighbor, do you know what? I am without. Because until we say to someone else, I need help, we're not going to find it. So I think this is very helpful for us to really get down into the grounded reality of our lives and what is it that we're experiencing. Yes, and as Andrea is saying, that we have to find a way to let our voices be heard. I think this is the space as well. So I really want to encourage you to please let your voices be heard. I want you to contribute now. If you want to unmute and share some of your thinking and reflections, please do. We've got a little bit more time. I just need to check in with Mishka how we're doing for time, and because I know we had a few things we wanted to talk about this afternoon, but I want to just allow this for an open mic session. If you'd like to make a thought, a contribution, please do. I see Yolanda said that we can also bring a moral and ethical dimension to environmental discourse. So this is very important. These are some of the fundamental tools that we have. I'm just going to mute myself for a moment and let someone else unmute and see what you'd like to say and contribute. You know, and this thing of reminding each other, you know, we have to remind each other of our purpose and what we want to achieve together. So I think let's keep reminding each other of what it is that we want. That also strengthens our voices. When we persist, we keep saying what it is that we want to see. Tammy, I see you've turned your camera on. I'm hoping that means you're going to share with us. Or anyone else, please. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, my sister. I'm Tammy from South Africa, Limpopo province. I'm from 7th generation sustainable community development project. I'm an agroecology practitioner. It's long since I've been listening to what you were all sharing. This is very beneficial to me. We are also working on the issue of environmental justice, whereby we are planting indigenous trees in various communities, in ECDs. We're also giving our children trees as gifts in our ECDs to promote reforestation. Also capacitating people on agroecology farming practices. And we also teaching them that we mustn't pollute our environment. We must always make it a point that we recycle all the recyclable materials so that we can mitigate these issues of climate change. I'm still learning and I've learned a lot here on this platform. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you too. Thanks for inspiring us with your actions that you're taking. Yeah, planting a tree and keeping it alive is an act of faith. And being part of the restoration of our planet is so important. And I think sometimes we underestimate the importance of that. And how can we be a movement that takes action together? So that was really inspiring. Thank you, Tammy. Who else can I encourage to share? We love to hear faith leaders' voices. It inspires us, and I think it also inspires others. So please don't be shy. I really want to encourage you to give your thoughts. If you have any other questions about COP, Mishka and I can try and answer them. But also if you want to share some thoughts about ways that we can take action as people of faith with climate change, please do share.
Okay, sorry, my sister. Sorry, I forgot something very important around the issue of climate change. Drought. We have an ongoing drought in Limpopo, whereby we have lost many cattle due to drought. So we are declared as a water scarcity province. There's no water, even drinking water. There's no water. Rivers are dry. We are suffering a lot when it comes to climate change. That is why we are capacitating people, raising awareness about climate change causes, mitigation and adaptation strategies. How can we adapt to these changes? Moreover, in our farms, because when the climate is like this, even the food insecurity is a problem. Malnutrition is a problem. Remember, in Mopani, we have the Mopani worms, which is 2 years now. There are no Mopani worms because of the climate change. Even now, there are no Mopani worms. We used to catch them. It boosts our economy, but it's 3 years now. We don't have that because of climate change. So poverty is escalating. Food prices are going high. Most of us are unemployed. So yeah, that's what I wanted to share. We have lost our cattle. No cattle that are alive now because of these changes in the climate. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tammy. Yeah, that's really scary. And we know of this extremely severe drought that has been experienced in parts of Southern Africa. And it's a huge impact it's having. And how we've heard from scientists that how a drought like this can be recovered from if we get enough rain. But if we have another one, then that starts to cause existential threats. And we can hear the extent of the impact from what Tammy shared. So thank you so much for sharing that, those frightening stats around the Mopani worms and also the cattle. Everyone, I'm aware that we are getting low on time. And I wanted to ask anyone in the room who's coming to COP29 who would like to share your plans for COP29. I can go first. SAFCEI will be having 2 events. One is an official side event that Sinessa is the lead organizer on. So it will be in the official documentation, and we can also share this around. And secondly, we'll also be speaking on a panel at the Faith Pavilion, where we'll be talking about intergenerational justice and how communities in Africa can become more climate resilient. And we're very pleased and thankful that SAINESA, the Catholic Youth Network, organized both of these events and invited us to be on the panel. We'll also be attending some other events. We'll be in the Faith Pavilion. We'll be meeting with AFSA, the African Alliance for Food Sovereignty. That's another area that we'll be following. My colleague Gabriel will be there, and also Tara, my other colleague, and we'll also be looking at energy and climate change. In particular, we'll be looking at any developments on nuclear energy. We're very interested to see how the NDCs fall out. Loss and damage is also an adaptation are major concerns for Africa, and those are areas that we're going to be focusing on. So that's our plans for COP. And we will be sharing, we do have a draft statement, but we want to share it after the COP, and then people can see if they want to sign on. But it's something that we've been working on. As we've been talking to faith leaders throughout the year, concerns and the impact of climate change. And that's something that we want to really release at the end of COP29, as we start looking at in the run-up to COP30 in Brazil next year. And also to flag on when we're back from COP, we will be having a COP digestion webinar. And we will be hearing from some leaders on their digested view of the COP and how it went this year. We will be having Million Belay from AFSA, and we hope also to have a representative from the World Resources Institute, as well as someone potentially from another climate justice network. So those are our plans coming up, and we will be sharing that with you all so you can join us. If you're not part of SAFCEI's mailing list, please make sure to send your email address to us so we can add you. We did have someone in the room who is going to be at COP. That's Indivile. Unfortunately, she's had to leave, so she's not going to be able to present. But I'm just wondering if anyone else here now would like to share plans for COP.
Yeah, we are not sure if we attend or no. We lost the support because of badge. So now we start again to try to find support. So maybe until Monday we will have the real situation, if we will attend or no. Yeah. But if you have any plan, please share with me on the email so that we can follow your meetings, please. And if we get support, we will meet you there so that we can follow the SAFCEI meeting. Thank you.
Great, definitely. And the other thing I can offer you, Yolanda, I know it's been very difficult this year with funding, and it's an expensive country to travel to. So if you're not able to travel, but you'd like to attend COP, SAFCEI has what is a virtual attendance. I've got about 8 or 9 virtual badges. And if you'd like to use one and have a SAFCEI badge, I'd be more than happy to offer it to anyone here. You would need to send me your passport details, as well as various other things about yourself, date of birth, where you live, job title, and so on. But if you send that to me, I'd be very happy to offer you a virtual badge, and you can join the COP from wherever you are and have a look. Yeah. So it's an absolute pleasure to do that. And so please do just drop me a line. I'll put my email address in the chat here, so you can
Yeah,
email
no
me
problem.
directly.
No
Yeah.
problem. On Monday, I will back to you.
Okay, just to bear in mind the deadline. This is actually a very important point. The deadline is Sunday. And
Okay.
I'm not available to do it on Sunday. So please, if you want it, you will need to do it by tomorrow. So
Okay.
it's a quick picture of your passport with all your details, and you can WhatsApp that to me. I'll give you my WhatsApp number as well. And then you also need to give me
No, I have your WhatsApp number.
yeah, a few other designated information. Okay, brilliant.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks too. So does anyone else have any other contributions on COP, thoughts that they'd like to share? I'm just trying to give you guys one last moment or two. But it seems like we've covered it. So I am going to hand over to Mishka. Thank you, Mishka.
Thank you, Francesca, and thank you all for joining us today. We've heard some very valuable insights from Francesca and Steve and some of the faith leaders on the significance of COP29 and global climate negotiations, and also the powerful role that faith communities play in advocating for climate justice. So yeah, we appreciate your engagement and all the questions, and let's carry that energy forward, stay connected. If there are any events that you do know of, please let us know as well. And yeah, thank you once again, and take care.
Thanks, everyone. Be seeing you, if not at COP or online, then definitely at the COP digestion meeting that we'll be having in a few weeks' time. Take care, everyone. Bye for now.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.